Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this tutorial is called Contrasts in Composition. So this is a tutorial that I wrote in text form about 10 years ago, and it is one of my more popular tutorials compared to the others, but on top of that, it's also a really important topic, and so I decided to, instead of just keeping the text tutorial, I would also do a YouTube version of it so that people on my YouTube channel could learn from it as well. So in composition theory, a more pleasing composition is a composition that contains contrast. And when I talk about contrast here, I don't mean like the contrast control in Photoshop, although that can be used sometimes to create the kind of contrast that we'll be discussing here. What I'm talking about is the original definition of the word contrast, and that is the state of being strikingly different from something else, typically something in juxtaposition or close association. So contrast is any two opposing things, like for example black and white is a contrast, or big and small is a contrast, or soft and hard, loud and quiet, thick and thin, textured and smooth. All of these are contrasts. Now in composition theory we use contrast generally for two reasons. So the first is to create visual interest, to help move the eye around the painting to keep it from becoming bored. Or the second reason is to create a point of emphasis, or also known as a focal point, which is creating one or two areas in the image that the eye is drawn to first. And that's usually the object that's the most important thing in the image, like for example the hero of the story. So we're going to discuss contrasts, and I'll split it into two parts, and we'll start with part one, which is about creating visual interest, and we'll see all the different ways we can use contrast to make an image more aesthetically pleasing. So the first type of contrast we're going to look at as part of part one, contrast to create visual interest, is contrast in value. So let's start with this simple image here. And this image might be fine as a wallpaper, but it certainly doesn't get your attention. And after all, you know, wallpaper isn't about getting attention. It's about kind of blending into the background. So, as far as contrast to value goes, we have here dark gray and black. So let's instead change the dark gray to white. So already this has far more contrast in it. And that's the sort of contrast that we think of when we think of the contrast control in Photoshop. It makes the blacks blacker and it makes the whites whiter. So value contrast is perhaps the strongest contrast you can use, and a large chunk of our vision system is actually reserved specifically for interpreting value. And that's why black and white movies still work today, because our eyes are hardwired to respond to value in a very strong way. But while there's this is a very contrasty image, another thing it's missing is different sorts of value of contrast. So, because there's only two values in this image, there's black and there's white. So while the white is contrasting with the black elements do not contrast with the other black elements. So let's try varying the contrast a little bit. So even though this image is less contrasty in a way, because some of these, as you can see, are lighter and closer to the white, in another way it has more contrast because the individual elements are now different from each other, and that makes the eye happier. So the next contrast is contrast in size. So each element in this image is the same size, which is far too regular and kind of machine-like. So let's randomly scale the different elements. And just by doing that, this is a big improvement in terms of contrast of scale. And also note that which sizes you pick can be as important as making sure the objects all have a different size. For example, if you look at these 5 elements here, they do have contrast in size since they're all different sizes. However, the contrast itself is pretty regular since each eye is 75% the size of the previous one. So instead, if we do this, now not only is each element a different size, but there's no obvious pattern to these sizes. And this generally provides more organic and visually pleasing result. So next is contrast in position. So while each element is a different size here, they're all evenly spaced. So let's add some contrast to their location. So here, each element is a different distance from its neighbor, but if you look at the image overall, like if you squint at it, it still feels kind of evenly spaced. So let's increase the randomness. So this draws the eye through the image more successfully, sort of jumping from island to island of detail. So contrast in position also shows off another principle, which is that of clumping and grouping, since the elements in the image sort of clump together. And if you go to my website, neilblevins.com, and go to the art lessons section, there's a written tutorial about clumping and grouping, which you might want to check out. I'll include a link to it in the info. So just as a side note, there's also something called contrast in detail, and that's sort of a combination in contrast of position and contrast in size. So it's the idea that you have some large areas with very little detail and some small areas with tons of tiny detail, creating sort of areas of detail and then areas of visual rest. And that's another important type of contrast to consider. So contrast in hue and saturation. And you have hue and saturation as another way to create contrast. And hue is the actual color, like red, blue, or green. And saturation is how pure the color is. So in paint terms, a color that's mixed with white or black is less saturated. So this image here doesn't have much of contrast as this one does. Even though from a value perspective, the blue color is identical to the yellow color, because you have the two different colors, that creates contrast. And this image here doesn't have as much contrast as this image here. And that's because in this one I took the background, and the background is the same value, but now it has a reduced saturation. Now we have contrast in shape. So in this example, all the elements are the same base shape, being a square, although there is some contrast in position and size. So changing the shape to be more random can create some nice contrast. But in this case, of course, even though they're different shapes, in general they're all still squares or rectangles. And so another way of doing that is by adding real contrast in shape. And that's to have some shapes that are rounded, while others are hard-edged. And now we have contrast in edge quality. So this is basically blurry versus hard edges. So you can give a little visual variety by making some of the objects softer and some of the other objects harder. So now that we've gone through all of the contrasts to create visual interest, let's move on to part 2, which is contrast to create emphasis or a focal point. So let's say that you have a superhero film and you give your hero a bright red cape, and then the other colors around them are all desaturated brown. So that's a great example. You've just used contrast and hue saturation in order to create a focal point, and that leads the viewer's eye to the most important thing in the scene, which is your hero. Larger objects are also frequently the focal point, and areas of high contrast in value are also frequently used as a focal point. So let's start with contrast in value. So in this example, the black dot has a lot of contrast with a white background and the light gray dots, whereas the light gray dots have less contrast between themselves and the white background. So your eye will tend to look first at the black dot, and that makes it the focal point. And now remember, this is the same thing we did with contrast of value to create visual interest. It's just this time we're using the same technique for a slightly different goal, which is instead of using it to move the eye around, we're going to use it to direct the eye to one specific spot. As a similar example, you can use light, say in your painting. Like for example, let's place a lantern in a dark room, and that'll draw the eye to the lantern using contrast in value. And then you place the focal point near the lantern. So in this case, let's say the focal point is a person. That's the thing you want people to look at. So even though the focal point itself is not the area of the most contrast, the area of the most contrast brings the eye very close to where the focal point is. And then the eye jumps to the focal point because the focal point has something else interesting about it that also helps draw the eye. So that's a way to use two contrasts together to draw the eye to the same spot. Now we have contrast in size. So making something big among smaller nearby objects can really create a very strong focal point. But at the same time, this can also be done by making something very small in a world of large objects. Sometimes people will say make something big in order to make it a focal point, but it's not necessary for your object to be big. It just has to be very different in size than the elements around it to draw attention. So contrast in position. Putting something off on its own, away from a group, can also really create a focal point. And this is sometimes known as emphasis through isolation. And then once again, talking about contrast and detail, you can also place an area of visual rest next to the focal point. In this case, the focal point would probably have tons of small detail. And that area of rest would lead the eye to the focal point due to contrast and detail. So in a similar fashion, having tons of small detail at the focal point and less detail elsewhere will direct the eye to the focal point. People use this all the time in paintings. The character will have a lot of small intricate detail on, say, their clothing, but the background will be painted far looser and more abstract, so the eye ignores the background and focuses on the character. So now contrast and hue saturation. Just like value, different colors can create contrast. And some colors stand out a lot more than others, and some colors next to other colors stand out. So you can use this to create emphasis on certain elements. Like, let's say you give an element or a set of elements color red, where all the other elements are green, then the eye will tend to move towards the red element. And also note, the red objects, even though they're 6 separate eyes, get grouped together visually into a single large red object using grouping clumping theory. That's something that's discussed more in the tutorial on my website about grouping and clumping. And then in a similar fashion, if you have a supersaturated color in an image, and then otherwise the image is very desaturated, that will also draw the eye, like being drawn to that one eye in the middle. So in general, brighter saturated colors tend to be more eye-catching, and darker desaturated colors tend to be less eye-catching. Warm colors like red or yellow tend to jump forward to the eye, and cool colors like blue and purple tend to recede. And that's why if you want to make a small room look larger, people say paint it a darker color, cooler color. That way the walls will tend to recede, making it seem as though the room is actually bigger, even though it's absolutely the same size. And if you paint it with a saturated bright color, like a bright red, that'll make the walls seem to leap out at you, and so the room will seem smaller than it really is. And finally, a common way to get contrast in hue is to have the focal point one color, and then the background to be the complementary of that color, like for example an orange human against a blue background. Then contrast in shape. So if you have a lot of one type of shape, just changing the type of shape on a single object can really emphasize it, like the circle amongst all these squares. Or, here we have one shape that has all equal-sized lines, the one on the left, and then the second shape uses a combination of thick and thin lines. And one with the contrasting thick and thin lines probably draws the eye first. And then we have contrast in edge quality. The eye is drawn to hard edges first, so one technique is to make your background soft and have the edges of your focal point hard in order to draw the eye. So here's a couple of practical examples. So this is a starship hull image. It's kind of like, the outside of the Death Star or something like that. And I've used contrast in shape, value, size, position, and detail to create visual interest and nice areas of detail and rest. But this particular image doesn't have a strong focal point. But here's another image using very, very similar techniques to the previous image. But this one not only creates visual interest, but also has a focal point, which would be the circular vent in the upper left of the image. So for our focal point, I used contrast of shape, which is something circular in the middle of a bunch of straight pipes. I use contrast of value, where the circle is brighter than surrounding things. And I use contrast of size and position and detail, since there's a lot of tiny detail near the focal point, but the focal point itself is rather simple in shape and detail. And I also used other techniques to make it a focal point, such as the lines pointing towards it from every direction. But that's a topic for another tutorial, specifically about creating focal points. And then one extra note is the placement of the circle actually fights a little with the eye in terms of being the focal point. So frequently focal points should be near the center of your image or in other predefined places, like along the lines of the rule of thirds. So if I wanted to improve my focal point, I might consider moving the placement of the focal point slightly from where it is, because it's a little bit close to the edge of the composition. So there we go. Hopefully you found this interesting. I know it's a lot of information to digest, but hopefully you'll remember some of it next time you have to make an image and you remember to use the rule of contrasts. It could help that you take a boring pattern and give it more life, or it might also help direct your eye to the focal point of the image. Or it could do the opposite, like if you wanted to hide an object that's not supposed to be as important, reducing its contrast with its neighbors will help it melt into the background. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and please visit my website, neilblevins.com, and go to the Art Lessons section if you want to see more tutorials about similar subjects. And feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to be notified the next time I post a video. Thank you very much.